Okay, well, I think we're recording, so let's begin. Welcome to Chapter 1 of the Rathus Introductory Psychology textbook. We're going to explore the topic of what is psychology. This is an introductory chapter, just a nice overview about what psychology is, where it originates from, and how psychologists sort of know what they know. So I am your host, your instructor, John Chansey, and I'll be presenting these chapters over a series of videos. I'm not going to record each chapter all in one video. I'll probably break it up into multiple videos. That way, it's a little more digestible. You don't have to sit down and read or excuse me, you don't have to sit down and watch an hour-long PowerPoint recording, but maybe, you watch a 20-minute one and then come back the next day and watch another 20-minute one, and then, and so on and so forth. I think that's a little more digestible. There's a lot of research behind that suggests that learning is more efficient that way. So anyways, we're going to be exploring the topic of what is psychology. So at the beginning of every chapter, I'm also going to be kind of getting you acclimated to the Rathus text. At the beginning of every chapter, there's also learning outcomes. So by the end of this chapter, this is what should happen as far as, you're learning about psychology. So at the end of this chapter, you should be able to, define what psychology is and be able to describe what psychologists do. You should have a pretty good idea about the origins of psychology, where it comes from, some of the important figureheads, people who have made major contributions to the field of psychology, and a lot of those names are going to come up again and again and again. So it's really important, to understand their contributions now, because you're going to see those names pop up a lot, like Sigmund Freud, for example, or Jean Piaget, or Lev Vygotsky. These are names that are going to come up a lot. We're also going to be looking at different theoretical perspectives of psychology and how those inform the examination of behavior and mental processes. Theoretical perspectives, I like to think of them as like lenses of glasses. You're seeing the same thing, the same phenomena, but if you were wearing different types of glasses, you would see that phenomena differently. For example, if you were looking at a painting and you're wearing rose-tinted glasses, you're going to see the painting as maybe very rose-tinted, very red, and, you might miss some things. You might miss some things about other colors, or you may, not notice certain things going on in the painting, but versus somebody who's wearing a pair of maybe reading glasses, to help them see better. Maybe they see a lot more detail, and they see this picture, in a different way than you would if you're wearing the rose-tinted glasses. So that's really what theoretical perspectives are. They're just different ways of looking at phenomena in psychology. And when we say phenomena, it just means anything that's occurring, anything that's happening. You'll also be able to, by the end of this chapter, be able to explain, how psychologists conduct research. Psychologists don't know what they know just by guessing and making just random guesses. No, they conduct research. They're using the scientific method to answer questions that they have. And we'll talk more about that here in a few slides. You'll also be able to explain how psychologists engage in that type of research. We're going to talk about different types of research, including observational research, correlation, experimental. This is just a very nice overview. It's not the end-all, be-all comprehensive list of research methodology, but it's a nice place to start. We'll also look at the ethics involved in conducting research with both humans and non-humans, or animals. And then finally, we're going to look at the role of critical thinking. So you've probably heard that term, critical thinking, a lot, and it's important, I think, for all studies. But we'll talk a little bit about the end of why it's important for psychology specifically. So these are kind of things that I think by the end of the chapter, it would be good to kind of assess yourself and go back through these objectives once you finish reading the chapter and think, okay, can I do these things? Can I identify and discuss principles of critical thinking? Can I discuss ethical standards? And if you can do those things, to yourself or maybe to someone else, describing to someone else, then you really have learned something. You know the material. Also, every chapter starts with a series of true-false questions. In the text, you'll find these as well. My recommendation to you is maybe pause this video now and then maybe kind of answer these questions to yourself, true, false. Well, the answers will reveal themselves as you read and as we go through the PowerPoint, but maybe just prime yourself, kind of start thinking about these ideas ahead of time. Now would be a good time to pause and maybe jot down your answers to these true or fiction questions, and I'll leave you to do that. All right, so looks like welcome back. So what is psychology? The first thing we want to do is define psychology. You probably came into this classroom with some ideas about what psychology is. Maybe, you have some conceptual understanding of what psychology is before coming into the class. Maybe you associate psychology with the treatment of mental illness, for example. That's a really common conception that people have about psychology, is they think it's the study of helping people with mental illness, trying to understand, trying to diagnose and prescribe and things like that. And those are all part of psychology, but more broadly speaking, there's a little more to it than that. Broadly speaking, psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Behavior, let's break this down. Scientific study means that it adheres to the scientific method. Behavior referring to anything that we can observe and see, standing up, walking around, taking notes, talking on a cell phone, all of these things that we can see and measure objectively. Those are behaviors. And mental processes are all the things that are kind of going on between our ears, our thoughts, our motivations, our dreams. I mean, all the things that's going on between our ears. And the goal of this scientific study is to describe behavior and mental processes, explain it, predict it, and sometimes even control it. And we're going to kind of look at all of these, describe, explain, predict, control, individually as we kind of go throughout the course. So just know that psychology is more than just the study of mental illness. It is. We'll get into that a little more further in just a couple slides. I think this will make a little more sense. And some of these classroom demonstrations you can probably see. Unfortunately, I'm probably not going to be using many of these. These go to like links in the PowerPoint that some may or may not work. So if you see me just like not discuss these things, these little classroom demonstrations, there's a reason why. It's because I don't really find it useful for our discussion. So there's that. So psychology is a science, and like all sciences, it's driven by theory. And when I say theory, these aren't just like guesses. Well, they kind of are guesses, but they're much more educated than that. They aren't, some people use that word theory around. They toss it around very lightly. And I think for something, in order for something to become a theory, an idea or hypothesis, for it to become a theory, it has to undergo a very rigorous process known as the scientific method, which we'll discuss in a couple of slides. So I guess I'm just trying to say is be careful when you use that word theory. Sometimes people will say, oh, it's just a theory. And like they're really kind of discrediting that word. And I think theory is a very powerful word in terms of knowledge. It takes a lot of work and effort and revision of knowledge and building of knowledge to develop theory. So in psychology, a theory allows us to understand the relationship between events or why things happen by coming up with explanations, and then also trying to make predictions in the future. That's the big thing, is it allows us to make explanations and predictions, especially in regard to behavior, mental processes, and also biological processes, which we'll talk about, I think, more in chapter 2. So what do psychologists do? Broadly speaking, most psychologists will conduct research in some form or fashion, whether it's pure research, more theoretical research, developing theories, or more applied research. Applied research would be maybe a researcher who's developing a new therapy technique to help with rates of depression, or somebody who's trying to develop a new drug to treat anxiety. That's actually applying theoretical knowledge to maybe improve the quality of life or whatever the goal may be. Others may practice psychology. For example, if you're a counselor, you would offer counseling service to individuals or groups or whomever. If you're an industrial organizational psychologist, maybe you'd work as an HR rep for a company. So practicing psychology looks very different depending on what role you have in psychology, and we'll talk about more of that on the next slide. And then also, a lot of people in psychology, if you have a degree in psychology, especially a master's and above, you teach. Myself, I'm working on a PhD, and I teach. Obviously I'm teaching introductory psychology, I teach lifespan psychology, and I also teach some educational psychology courses over at the University of Oklahoma. So a big part of what psychologists of any part of psychology do is to teach others. So, as I mentioned before, that a lot of people come into this course kind of thinking about psychology in terms of mental illness or the treatment of, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I really want to hit home that there's much more to psychology than just the study of mental illness. If you look at this list, fields of psychology, you can see it's a pretty broad list. Clinical and counseling would probably be more along the lines of working with treatment or helping people with mental illnesses, but as you can see, school, educational, social, forensic, sport, all of these other fields they aren't necessarily, they may involve working with people with mental illness in some cases, in school settings or whatever. But there's mental illness isn't necessarily driving the bus, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's a very diverse field, and I'm hoping that through this chapter and others that you'll see that. Psychology, as it is a science, but it really dates back to pre-science. If we go back, to philosophy of people like Aristotle, Democritus, I think I'm pronouncing his name right. I may not be. I apologize if I'm not. And Socrates. I mean, these were some of the first people who really sat down and thought about, what it means to be a human, and through philosophy, rationalism and empiricism and things like that, really studied this idea of what it means to be a human being. So I want, psychology is a pretty new science, but it dates back pretty far if we really want to dig deep. So let's look at the first truth or fiction. More than 2,000 years ago, Aristotle wrote a book on psychology with content similar to the one you are reading. True or false? Maybe pause now and check your own comprehension. The answer is true. The answer is true. You can read more about that in your textbook. I don't want to spend too much time focusing on some of these questions. Next one, the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates suggested a research method that is still used in psychology today. That is also true. Introspection, know thyself, big part of Socrates' philosophy. All right, let's keep moving on. So psychology is a very new laboratory science. Relatively speaking, it dates back to 1860. Gustav Theodor Fechner, as you can see, published a text known as The Elements of Psychophysics. But really, the first laboratory, as a science, really we look at Wilhelm Wundt, who came up with the first laboratory that studied reaction times in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So it's a pretty relatively new science. Not less than 300 years old. So that's compared to others like physics and chemistry and biology and things like that. It's a pretty relatively new science. So now what we're going to do is I'm switching slides. We're going to start looking at some of the early perspectives in psychology, some of these theoretical perspectives that help shape psychology. And the first one is structuralism. And it's founded by Wilhelm Wundt, who I discussed on the previous slide. There's a picture of Mr. Wundt on the right-hand side. The idea was looking at the basic structures of the mind. We want to break things down. We want to break the conscious experience of being human into objective sensations, subjective feelings, and mental images. So think about it in terms of if we break down the conscious experience of having a chocolate cake, a piece of chocolate cake, we can see these different elements, these different structures at play. So, you take a bite of a piece of chocolate cake and the objective sensation would be, oh, this is chocolate. I'm tasting chocolate on my palate. My mouth isn't going to confuse the taste of chocolate for the taste of orange slices. It's a pretty objective sensation across the board. And then subjective feelings, if we see these come into play, well, I really like chocolate, so this is a very subjectively pleasant experience for me. Whereas other people, if they're trying to diet or maybe they don't like chocolate, it's not a pleasant experience. In fact, it's the opposite. And then, obviously mental images, thoughts, we have all kinds of thoughts about chocolate. If we really like chocolate, we have lots of pleasant thoughts about chocolate. We can't wait to have chocolate. But, if we don't we're trying to diet, we may have lots of negative mental images. Oh, well, I'm trying to avoid chocolate, and that's bad. So the idea behind this is that our the conscious experience is a combination of these objective experiences or sensations combined with our subjective feelings and images. So that's the basic structure of the mind. Wilhelm Wundt, he was the one who sort of theorized this first. Now, if we move forward, we look at another perspective called functionalism, founded by William James. William James is pretty famous inside and outside of psychology. He's also famous in advertisement as well. But he came up with another theoretical perspective called functionalism, basically looking at the mind and behavior in terms of, well, what function does it serve? What is the benefit? This is kind of getting in a little bit into evolutionary psychology, but essentially we want to break it down to the functions. What are the basic elements or functions? And I forgot to mention this in the previous slide, but structuralism, the idea, how do we understand, how do we get to these conscious experiences? Well, we do introspection. Introspection, know thyself, really getting to know oneself deeply. Rather than that, William James preferred more direct observation. Let's see behavior in action. Let's see the results of mental processes. Let's see, then we can decide the function, how useful, how functional it is. Again, kind of influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. So let's move on to behaviorism, another school of thought that actually is still in play. There are still some people who kind of subscribe to behaviorism. It's founded by Watson, John B. Watson, We'll talk more about him. But the focus of this is let's forget about everything that's going on between the ears and focus on what is observable and measurable, and that is behavior. Behavior is what's observable. I can watch, in a classroom, I can watch how many times you get up and distract your fellow classmates. We can observe, if you're out at the casino, we can observe how many times you pull the lever. Those are just examples of observable behaviors that we can take count of. We can measure them. We can compare and contrast, things like that. So John B. Watson is one of the founders. B.F. Skinner is also really important. We'll talk more about him when we get to chapter 5 and how we learn. One of the ways we learn is through reinforcement. When our responses are encouraged, let's say, for example, if somebody says, hey, good job after you finish your test, that might reinforce the behavior of studying for the test. Hey, I want another good job. I want another high five. I want another good grade. That reinforces my behavior. So we'll talk more about that later. I don't want to overwhelm you with too much. Read the description of figure 1.2 in your text. I don't want to go over it right now. Gestalt psychology comes from Germany, another theoretical perspective. Names like Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka, Wolfgang Kohler are really important. We'll talk about these people again in chapter 3. But this is getting into a little bit of sensation and perception. How we think and how we problem solve is determined by our perception of things. And it's this idea that our perception is more than the sum of the parts. And this will make a lot more sense when we get to chapter 3, when we get into sensation and perception. I don't want to spoil it too much. I just want to kind of introduce you to some of these ideas and then kind of move forward. So these are some of the Gestalt principles we'll look at in chapter 3. Also, read through the figure 1.3 in your textbook and go through these and see what you think. So insight, how do we problem solve? Insight is another one of those, we're going to talk about this again in chapter 5. Read figure 1.4 in your text. Psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud is a name you've probably heard before. We're going to talk about Freud a lot, and he's going to come up in almost every other chapter. So what I want you to know about psychoanalysis is the idea is to tap into the unconscious mind, to get into that part of the mind that, maybe we're not even aware of, that those sort of internal drives and sensations and urges that maybe we're not aware of. And through therapy and through insight and other forms and things like that, we can get into our unconscious mind, according to Freud. And so we'll talk more about him all throughout the course, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. Here's some other perspectives to consider. Biology, especially in chapter 2, we're going to look at the role that biology plays in understanding behavior and mental processes. We're going to look at the brain. We're going to look at the role that hormones play, heredity. We're going to look at some evolutionary psychology. So all of these things are important. Our behavior is very much a byproduct of the genes that we inherit from our parents, from the hormones that course throughout our body, and the way our brain develops. So those are all really important. We'll come back and talk about those again. We'll talk about Darwin again. Kind of an unpopular name in the state of Oklahoma, but hey, we got to talk about him. He's important. It was important. Still is, I should say. Cognitive perspective, this is the opposite of behaviorism. Behaviorism says, hey, what's going on between the ears isn't important. Cognitive perspective says that is the most important thing. What's going on between our ears is very important. Mental processes, otherwise known as the mind. So our thoughts, our dreams, all our motivations, all of these things that go on between our ears, very, very important to the cognitive perspective. A humanistic existential perspective, this is the much more optimistic perspective on human behavior and mental processes. Humanism is sort of built around this idea that everyone is capable of getting better, of self-improvement, of self-fulfillment, and making better choices and better decisions. And you kind of tack that on with this sort of existentialist philosophy that we all have free will. These kind of go together to say that, hey, we have free will to make make choices and to grow and be better versions of ourselves. We have that ability as human beings because of our free will. And this is tied to the ideas from Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, who we will talk about again, I think, on our chapter on motivation and then other subsequent chapters. So we'll come back to them later. Psychodynamic is sort of a neo-Freudian perspective. Not a whole lot. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here, but just know these are kind of the followers of Freud who run with some of the ideas that Freud presented early on, but kind of changed and modernized them. And we'll talk more about them later. But just know that a lot of the ideas that Freud presented in his work are mostly outdated, but some of them have still survived and been modernized through psychodynamic perspective. And we'll talk about that later. We'll also look at learning behavior, why we learn. We're going to spend a whole chapter on learning. The behaviorist view is that learning is the byproduct of reinforcement, rewards and punishments, things like that. Social cognitive is a little bit different. Our learning is the byproduct of our environment and also our thoughts. Those are very important. So maybe are kind of discounted in behaviorist perspective, but in the social cognitivist view, these things are really important. Sociocultural. This is saying is that our behavior and the way we think is determined by time and place, by our ethnicity, the culture we grew up in, our socioeconomic status, our gender. All of those things factor in to determine how you see and understand the world and how you act and think accordingly. So ethnicity is important, gender is important. All of those things are really important to understanding why we think and act differently. And specifically looking at gender, there are, especially in this country, there are certain concepts or ideas that are associated with masculinity or femininity. Males are supposed to act one way, females are supposed to act another way, and those are based on mostly social and cultural expectations. And we see those are drastically changing. Year by year, it seems those are changing. The lady pictured in this picture on the right, I believe this is Mary Calkins. This is one of the first women to earn a PhD in psychology, but there was a time and place where that was not the case, where women could not earn PhDs in psychology. Now, the vast majority of women or people who obtain PhDs in psychology are women. So we see a huge shift in terms of gender expectations and social roles along the lines of gender. So here is truth or fiction. Men receive the majority of doctoral degrees in psychology. Kind of already gave the answer to this away, but you can go ahead and test yourself by pausing the video here. Oops. The answer is fiction. It's women. Women earn more doctoral degrees in psychology than men. A huge change. Even though she had worked to complete all the degree requirements, the first female president of the APA, the American Psychological Association, turned down the doctoral degree that was offered to her. That is, in fact, true. The lady I talked about on the slide before, she completed all of the degree requirements, but was initially turned down. She turned down, I think, because they turned her down initially. It wasn't until later on. It's a really crazy story. Just goes to show how much has changed in the history of psychology. So this is going to be the end of our first video. Kind of went a little bit longer than I was expecting to, but that's okay. I want to end with a quick comprehension check. You can pause the video here in just a moment, but I want you to check your comprehension before moving on to part 2, just to make sure you're kind of caught up and you're aware of what we're talking about and you understand the ideas. So this comprehension check question is: the approach to psychology that focuses on self-fulfillment, altruism, and personal growth is A, the cognitive approach, B, the behavioral approach, C, the psychodynamic approach, or D, the humanistic approach. What I'd like for you to do now is to pause the video and try to answer this question. I'll give you a moment, and then I'll give you the answer. All right, you pause the video. You should have answered D, the humanistic perspective, or humanistic approach, excuse me. Go back a few slides, look at the humanistic approach. We talked about Rogers and Maslow, or you should have read about Rogers and Maslow. Humanistic approach. We're all capable of growth. We're all capable of becoming better people. Altruism, helping others for the sake of helping others, is a big part of this as well. We'll talk about that in a future chapter. So this is the first part of chapter 1. We're going to wrap up here and jump back into the second half at a later time. All right, thanks for tuning in.